Thumbelina. A long time ago there lived a kind woman named Mrs. Marigold who loved her garden but wished for a child. One day she saw a tiny garden fairy among her flowers. Mrs. Marigold asked the fairy for a child. Though reluctant, the fairy gave her a magical seed. Mrs. Marigold planted the seed, and within days it grew into a beautiful tulip. When the flower bloomed, inside was a tiny girl, no bigger than Mrs. Marigold's thumb. Overjoyed, Mrs. Marigold named her Thumbelina. Thumbelina brought great joy to Mrs. Marigold, helping with gardening, cooking, and playing in the water. She would float in an acorn shell and sing with her angelic voice. One day, a toad named Mrs. Burp overheard Thumbelina's singing. Enchanted, she decided Thumbelina would marry her son. That night, while Thumbelina was asleep in a walnut shell by the window, Mrs. Burp sneaked in, grabbed Thumbelina, and disappeared into the night. Thumbelina in the swamp. Mrs. Burp, the toad, took Thumbelina to a swamp and left her stranded on a lily pad. Scared and surrounded by water, Thumbelina cried herself to sleep. The next morning, Mrs. Burp introduced her son, Croaky, as Thumbelina's future husband. Croaky, a big toad with a loud burp and a love for bugs, scared and disgusted Thumbelina. When Croaky splashed around chasing a butterfly, Thumbelina scolded him. Upset, he hopped away to complain to his mother. Just then, a school of friendly fish offered to help Thumbelina escape. They chewed through the lily pad's stem, setting it free to float away as the burps tried to stop her. To distract the toads, the fish tickled them with their fins, giving Thumbelina enough time to drift down the stream. As she floated away, she admired the beauty around her and wished she could fly like a bird. Soon, a bright blue bird named Pete appeared. Hearing her story, Pete decided to help. He brought a string, tied the lily pad to his leg, and lifted it into the air like a flying carpet. Thumbelina laughed and felt free as she soared above the water with Pete. But just as she was enjoying her newfound freedom, something suddenly grabbed her. Up and away! Thumbelina was spinning, disoriented as Pete disappeared. A big brown bug named Buzz had grabbed her. Excited by his find, Buzz took her to a tree, boasting about her beauty. While he buzzed away to find food, two of his sisters arrived. The sisters mocked Thumbelina, pointing out her lack of wings and tiny head. Buzz, swayed by their teasing, realized he couldn't keep her. When Thumbelina demanded to be let go, Buzz flew her to the ground, placing her on a daisy before buzzing away. Alone and afraid, Thumbelina sighed in relief. At least she was free. All alone. Scared, hungry, and lonely, Thumbelina decided not to cry. She wandered through the forest, surviving on flower petals and moss, using leaves as shelter. One day she met a friendly ladybug named Ladybird, who offered to show her a blueberry patch. Excited, Thumbelina followed but slipped off a flower into an ant hill. The ants, mistaking her for a threat, shouted orders to protect their queen. Thumbelina scrambled to escape, climbing out of the slippery sand as an army of ants chased her. Running for her life, she found a small hole in a tree and hid inside. The ants eventually passed by, and Thumbelina, exhausted but safe, finally caught her breath. Finding new friends. As summer ended, the leaves fell, and Thumbelina, cold and tired, struggled to find food. While picking a nut, she met a squirrel who explained the need to prepare for winter. Thumbelina, unfamiliar with the season, wandered hungry until she fell asleep and woke up in a bird's nest. Two birds, Maggie and Chris, had rescued her. They fed her, kept her warm, and taught her bird songs, including secret talking songs. Thumbelina grew close to them, but as winter neared, the birds had to fly south. Saddened, Thumbelina bid her friends goodbye as they sang a song of farewell. Meeting Mrs. Grey, winter arrived, and Thumbelina, cold and starving, stumbled upon a hole in a cornfield. Inside, a kind mouse named Mrs. Grey welcomed her, offering food and warmth. Mrs. Grey taught Thumbelina how to sew and cook, and in return Thumbelina helped with chores. One day, Mrs. Gray overheard Thumbelina singing and decided she'd make a perfect bride for Mr. Rufus, a rich mole. Mrs. Gray's plans. Mrs. Gray invited Mr. Rufus over for tea, introducing him to Thumbelina. The mole, gruff and uninterested in sunshine or birds, dismissed Thumbelina's love for them. When Thumbelina sang, however, Mr. Rufus was captivated by her beautiful voice and decided she would be his bride. Unaware of the mole's intentions, Thumbelina kept singing, lost in memories of her home and her bird friends. Thumbelina's escape plan. The day before her wedding to Mr. Rufus, Mrs. Gray took Thumbelina to a tunnel the mole had dug to show off his home. Along the way, they came across a still bird lying in the tunnel. It was Pete. Thumbelina recognized him and, shocked, ran to his side. Though Mrs. Gray dismissed him as a dead nuisance, Thumbelina felt warmth in Pete's feathers. She realized he was alive but weak. That night, Thumbelina secretly brought him food and sang to him, hoping her songs would revive his spirits. Pete gradually regained his strength, and when spring arrived, he was ready to leave. Thumbelina, feeling trapped by the impending marriage, confessed her despair to Pete. He offered to take her away. A new life. On the morning of the wedding, as Mrs. Gray prepared Thumbelina, Pete flew into the tunnel. Thumbelina climbed onto his back, and they soared into the sky just as the mole arrived. The warm spring breeze brushed her face as Pete flew higher, taking her far away from her troubles. Pete brought Thumbelina to a meadow filled with flowers. Among them, Thumbelina spotted people her size, tiny fairies dancing and laughing. Their king, a handsome fairy with golden wings, approached Thumbelina and invited her to join their kingdom. Thumbelina was overjoyed. She and the fairy king became close friends, and eventually he asked her to marry him. This time, Thumbelina said yes, feeling truly happy and free. As the fairies crowned her their queen, they gave her delicate wings, and for the first time, Thumbelina flew, joining Pete and her new family in the sky. Thumbelina had finally found her place in the world, a land where she belonged, surrounded by beauty and love. And from that day forward, Thumbelina sang her songs, spreading happiness to all who heard them. Let's learn some words. Miniature meaning. Very small in size, a smaller version of something. Example, Thumbelina, being of miniature size, could sleep comfortably in a walnut shell. Captivity, meaning the state of being confined or imprisoned. Example, Thumbelina was held in captivity by the toad, who wanted her to marry her son. Adorned, meaning decorated or made more beautiful. Example, the field mouse's cozy home was adorned with tiny, colourful wildflowers. Dismal, meaning depressing, gloomy or cheerless. Example, the mole's underground home was dismal and dark, making Thumbelina long for sunlight. Liberation, meaning the act of setting someone free from imprisonment or oppression. Example, the swallow's timely intervention led to Thumbelina's liberation from the mole's gloomy world. Don't forget, like, share, and subscribe.